Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. Now, Simon, I came across a fascinating piece of research suggesting that the average Australian is going to change occupations not once, but more than twice over the next 20 years. And that's not just changing jobs. The suggestion was it's actually going to completely shift to a different occupation, Simon. So today I wanted to discuss it in today's podcast because I believe this is going to be of interest to everybody, no matter what job you're in, or even if you're not in the workforce yet or you've left the workforce, because it is going to affect somebody you know, even if it's not going to necessarily affect you. So, Simon, I think this is a worthwhile topic to discuss.
Absolutely. And there's so many different angles from which to discuss this and to figure out what it means for Australia. But of course, we need to remember that this is a forecast, that this is the idea of what do we think will happen in the future. And so far, if we look at ABS data about what is called job mobility rate, how often do we change jobs, particularly for our younger workers, we've seen that job mobility goes down or has been halving since the mid-90s. So we change jobs much less frequently at the moment than we've done in the 90s. And you go, well, sounds very counterintuitive because aren't all those technological trends and the shifting workforce, isn't it suggesting that we should grab more jobs, more different careers? And the answer is yes, we should. And we also would if it wasn't for, you guessed it, housing affordability. We are less willing to take risks. In order to change a job quite often, would traditionally speaking, make use of an opportunity that presented itself to it. And that more often than not meant you need to change city. You need to change jobs. And with housing being so hard to come by, with people being stuck in mortgages for 30 years, we are doing this less frequently, particularly the young workers. You can actually grab them as rather loyal workers these days.
It's interesting. If you would have asked me, I would have said in previous generations, people went to a job, stayed there for years, retired, they got a gold watch and a little ceremony at the end. A lot of people I know in my generation aren't in the same job as they were before, and many are not even in the careers that they studied for at university.
Yeah, and I very much am a firm believer of us needing to ready ourselves for this. And many a successful biography that you read has a couple of those exciting career changes in there where you bring your expertise from a certain industry to a new industry. And that actually gives you an edge because you have a different perspective if you play your cards right. So you have something special with you. I'm also a firm believer in the change in technology that some workers will just simply be forced to pick a new job. And that doesn't need to be a bad thing. Quite often, this might as well be a good thing for workers, but it is, of course, a major, major disruption in a person's life.
Well, that's interesting. So I guess it brings up the question, how do we as individuals, as employers and governments, and I know a lot of institutions and government people are listening to our show and watching our show. Hey, by the way, if you're new to this podcast, you don't currently subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to this, just stop for a second, click the subscribe button so that you get these pearls of wisdom from Simon every week. But I think it's important for people to understand how to transition successfully. If we get it wrong, we could end up with a skills mismatch, people falling out of the workforce industries, looking for talent they can't find. But if we get it right, Simon, this could actually be an opportunity for Australians to reinvent themselves and Australians to, I guess, reinvent themselves over their career, their working lives too, Simon.
Absolutely. And it is a good thing. Change is a good thing. It is scary, which is why we don't do it. And when I just said labor mobility is limited, it's because changing city, changing jobs just got scarier, got harder to pull off. And so I'd say ultimately as individuals, we're probably cheating ourselves out of a couple of opportunities. And as a country as a whole, we're changing ourselves out of productivity as well. So we do know that limited labor mobility is linked to poorer productivity outcomes. Now, it's as easy as saying, well, if you want to improve labor mobility, just make housing heaps cheaper. But that's a whole different
That's
discussion.
another discussion, isn't it? Well, let's just start with some basics. This prediction that Australians are going to change occupations 2.4 times over the next 2 decades. What's actually driving it? Is it just technology and AI, or are there other demographic or economic factors at play, Simon?
AI, technology, all that stuff is most certainly part of it. This is the idea that these things, they change the way that we work. Certain kind of tasks will be automated away. then out of this new tech roles will emerge. These necessitate somebody doing this job and transitioning out of some industry into that job. Of course, I'm legally required to point to demographics as a demographer. We have an aging workforce. So you have more and more people that retire. So you have this big vacuum of jobs as baby boomers leave the world behind. And then you only have a smaller cohort entering straight behind them into those jobs, the Gen Xers. So there is more opportunities for people to step into those roles. And these might well be people from outside of the industry. So that is opening up, creates certain kind of pressures within the workforce to upskill, to reskill. So that's important. And then, of course, we always need to change jobs, change careers if there is a major economic shift happening. So if certain kind of industries rise, they tend to maybe rise at the cost of another industry. So if we have much more renewables in there in the mix, we would lose certain kind of fossil fuel jobs. So these are slightly different skills then, which would need a job change. We talked about in the past the relative decline of manufacturing. So these manufacturing workers now need to do something else. And we're now blowing up the aged care sector to, we double it in about
Yeah.
50 years time. So somebody needs to do those jobs. Probably maybe some career shifters if we get it right, maybe completely new jobs, but that changes things. Of course, also, the reason why we see these changes for job change, or opportunity for job changes, we throw other things in there: globalization, global supply changes. If these are rejiggled, then we might have more or less warehousing jobs here, depending on what works. We have more or less import, which again then might translate into more or less manufacturing, depending on how well this goes. And of course, there's just simple preferences. If we tell different stories about what we consider is a decent job, people will want to act accordingly.
Yes.
And some people do change jobs because they are, I call them the gold rushes. So if you think that there is a wonderful opportunity somewhere, people rush to it. So people leave a career in banking and consulting because they thought crypto or blockchain or whatever is cool. And so they do a career pivot there. That's a gamble, but of course done in the hope to struck gold.
Well, are our current education systems set up to help workers in this mid-career change, or are we going to have to keep going back to some sort of training
No,
to be able to move to next jobs?
I'd say we must be much, much more flexible in giving people micro trainings left, right, and center. And to say, well, if you are interested in this new career, here is our boot camp where we push you through quite quickly. It's absolutely needed. Um, because we can't have people mid-career that are already established professionals in their sector go through detailed training in some sort of new field. I'm sure there's always a story of the MBA who turns, who builds violins later or something like this, who do this crazy pivot mid-career, do heaps of training in their 30s or 40s. But ultimately, if you change your jobs mid-career, you need money straight away, boom, boom, boom. You have time for minimal training.
Yes, it's very hard to imagine people going back to do long training, even though some people do after hours, weekend training to upskill themselves. Now, the article I got the concept to have this chat with you about was in the conversation. I'll put that link in the show notes. But one of the big takeaways for me was the concept that they came up with a whole of system approach, governments, industry, education providers, all pulling in the same direction. In practical terms, what could this look like? Is anyone even doing this in Australia?
Yeah, well, it's a fragmented system, and we of course always talk about these things of like how much better things are integrated. I always remember this in school when I realized that it's just you go to maths class, then you go to physics class, then you go to English class, and it's all these beautiful silos. You go like, that's not how anyone else views it outside of school. The world is just this big fat mix, and the more perspectives you throw into it, the more complex your worldview is, therefore. And so we need to adjust our education for this. If we want to make sure that workers are better equipped for job changes, for more complex views, you need to integrate these jobs much better into industry training and so forth.
Guess school education isn't going to be as useful in the future because the world is changing so fast. I learned something that you may still have in your day, a Dewey Decimal System, when you went to the library of how to research books, how to find a book on the bookshelves. I used a logbook and a slide rule to do maths because I wasn't able to use a calculator. My kids weren't allowed to use computers in school. Now everybody is. So it's all changing. happening in the way of education. But is AI and maybe automation going to help us if we're moving jobs rather than, yeah, on the one hand, it's going to help us maybe it'll replace some jobs, but will it actually help us in learning and personalizing training?
I'd say it's the ideal opportunity to create what we call individualized learning, where you can actually, and I've been at an education conference 2 weeks ago where a small high school had showcased their AI strategy. And the head teacher there, who was really into AI, did a live thing on stage where she said, "So my principal will give an update about the AI strategy. In the meantime, while he talks for 15 minutes, I will I will prepare the individual learning journey for this topic for the teacher, for the students. I have 17 students. I know that there are high achievers, middle achievers, low achievers, and 2 people with a learning disability. I will all provide them individualized learning sheets and learning tests and so forth." It's awesome. Really, really impressive what can be done. And so the goal of individualized learning, of actually feeding into a machine your more or less knowledge base background, and you say, "This is where I want to go. Give me the individualized learning journey." We can now make this happen. It takes, of course, skilled people to do this at the moment. It's not as easy as it sounds from the get go. You do need knowledge for it, but it is possible. So upskilling should become easier and better. So the L&D, the learning and development professionals of this world, I hope that they well and truly embrace AI and they figure out ways to better equip people for certain kind of jobs. And of course, a big organization, a big employer, better has all of their internal knowledge bases really well structured so that they can feed the knowledge in an individualized way to their workers. So there's exciting stuff happening here that we can do. So learning and development will be a completely new field in corporate Australia.
Now, we're talking about AI shrinking jobs. I saw a couple of very interesting graphics on a website I like looking at, Visual Graphics, Visual Capitalist, and they came up with a graphic of the world's fastest shrinking jobs and then also the world's fastest growing jobs over the next 5 years from 2025 to 2030. Not surprisingly, jobs with the biggest net decline were amongst postal service clerks, minus 40% of those jobs. 40% will go. Bank tellers and related clerks, data entry, cashiers and ticket clerks, administrative assistants and executive secretaries, accounting, bookkeeping, record keeping. Those jobs, and even telemarketers are going to go. But interestingly, they thought the world's fastest growing jobs will be big data specialists. They'll double in number. I'm not totally sure what a big data specialist is. Fintech engineers, AI and machine learning specialists, all these jobs will almost double. Software developers, warehouse specialists. So there's going to be a whole lot of new opportunities. And I guess there's also going to be a whole lot of jobs we haven't even thought about or known about, Simon.
No. And it's the same with the internet. If you put yourselves back into the late 90s, everyone had an email address back then already, kind of occasionally sent a couple of emails, kind of understood that the internet thing will be big in the future, but you didn't really know what this meant. You hadn't conceptualized social media. You hadn't really understood what online retail will do and so forth. So we're now at this point where everybody is fantasizing about what AI might be doing, but it just makes certain things much faster. It makes certain kind of ways of thinking, of delivering things possible. And why wouldn't new jobs emerge out of this?
I'm just looking back and thinking back to when people started getting email addresses and they gave themselves all sorts of funny names, which
They
now, as
do.
they're adults, they regret in some ways, don't they, Simon?
Absolutely. I think we quite quickly learned that your cool online username, email address, people let this fade out and then went to their boring first name dot last name at Gmail, and they called this a day.
Yes, it's hard to go for a job interview and give your email addresses, Funny Bunny or something like that.
You chose a very, very PC option here. Very good.
Yeah. If we talk about these changes occurring, and they are going to occur in our economy quickly, I can imagine that certain groups risk being left behind. We've spoken before about how rural communities are having more difficulty than capital cities, maybe people with lower formal educations or older people. Is this going to stratify our communities even more?
I would say so. I'd say that people that are not equipped to change, they are left behind. So there is the risk of becoming a Luddite, of then just hunkering down and say, well, but I want this type of job? Is this if a certain kind of industry becomes more or less obsolete and you are in an industry town, if you don't pivot, you will just sit there economically unproductive, not upskilling, and you will just spew frustration out into the world, and that's it. So you must change. If you think about the history of Australia, when a factory town closed, when something like a sawmill closed down somewhere, what do those workers do? They better change careers quite quickly. And we must prepare our people, our population now, for the likelihood that change is afoot quite quickly. And it can be embarrassing to upskill, to change careers if you are forced to do this rather than this is your own free will and you proactively choose something.
I agree with that. I guess it's partly our responsibility, but for employers, we say at Metropole, our biggest asset is our people or are our people. So I think businesses have a responsibility to help our team grow to the next level. I know some companies worry about training people because they could leave. I'd actually rather train them, but give them the right culture and environment to make them want to stay.
Absolutely. This is the main underlying narrative that I've been yapping on about. Demographically speaking, we run out of staff. So that means staff is a rare and even more important resource than they already were. So you must retain them. You must be an employer of choice. You must train them, make them more productive. And if you think that improving your staff makes them want to leave, then it doesn't speak in favor of your organization. You always want to make sure that your staff gets compensated if they increase their productivity. If they become better, more efficient, they should get a reward for it. And if you do this, I think people are very willing to stay. Again, because quite often you want to remember that your staff, they might have a mortgage. And if you have a 30-year mortgage, you rely for it for two dual incomes, and then you're less likely to change jobs. That's, by the way, yet another major reason why labor mobility is down, is that we now essentially always have two incomes in a
Yeah.
household. And so
Yeah.
you do not need to relocate one job, you need to relocate two jobs. And when I am leaving Melbourne to get a job in Adelaide, I have a job, my wife doesn't. So we then still have a level of uncertainty in there. Will she find a job that works for her? And
Yep.
then you go, better the devil I know, is quite often the case. So that's problematic. Not problematic, it's just what it is,
It is. Yeah.
to be honest. Yeah.
Now, in this show, we discuss a lot about migration and migration levels and how we're using migrants to fill the skills gap. Does this actually change the dynamics for Australian workers who are trying to switch occupations? Does the high migration level make it harder for locals to transition, or does it actually create opportunities in different industries?
Well, so if we were to manage our migration in the most ideal way, we would very much weaponize migration to fill skills shortages in a more efficient and direct way. So we would therefore not take any opportunities away from Australians because they go wherever they want to go, wherever it is most lucrative, and we just fill the gaps with migrants in a very strategic way. So therefore, in that scenario, migration is just cool. It's just easy. But the way that migration really works at the moment, it's not as targeted. Yes, in the medical field, we really have a targeted approach. But ultimately, we sometimes just give out short-term temporary type visas where people can work on whatever way they want. And so that is not us having real control over the linkage between migration and the workforce. So we should tighten that to begin with. But ultimately, I think migration is a part of the puzzle, is a part of the solution. Migrants tend to take the jobs that locals don't want. It is really locals come first come, first serve. Yes, there are potentials for tension there. When locals switch their careers, they might, of course, that there's a particular attractive field that they move into. And then there are also migrants. They could see them as competition, or of course. But ultimately, if you really establish a long-term strategic link between migration and job market, then migrants aren't in anyone's way. And then you get rid of this kind of like hateful narrative against migration as well, which should be good for society.
This show goes out on all the podcast apps and Spotify, but also on YouTube. And I am sure there's going to be a whole lot of people commenting on YouTube about how the migrants are creating all the problems. By the way, please keep leaving the comments because I love reading them, and I reply to most of them also. Now, Simon, I've got a couple more questions to ask you, but I know people actually ask me, what do you do and what does your role as a demographer do? And if people are interested in industry and getting you to speak to them or help them. So can you just give us a quick summary of what you do before I ask you a couple more questions?
Yeah, so well, as a demographer, my main job is to just constantly look at data, understand what it means, and then tell compelling stories about this data to an audience. My goal is always to put myself into the shoes of the audience, usually at conferences where I speak. And then I try to figure out, what does all of this demographic change mean for the financial services sector? What does it mean for this particular local government area? And what does it mean for lifeblood? What does it mean for blood donations? How do those trends actually impact the amount of blood that we can connect out of Australia? What does it mean for the foster care system? So everything has a demographic perspective, my self-serving view, that is. And I
Yes.
try to I try to tell this perspective.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes for people to get in contact with your team and Fiona, because if they'd like you to speak to their industry, their conference, their organization, I think from the experience that you're showing in these weekly sessions, you can add a lot of value. So let's see if you can add some value to somebody who's listening now. If you're advising, I don't know, a 25-year-old today, not on what job to take, but what skills to invest in. So because they're probably going to be working another 40 years, what would you tell them?
I would first tell them, yes, you do need to be technically good. Whatever job, whatever industry it is, there is a certain kind of technical skills that you need to have, a certain kind of basics knowledge base to become a truck driver. You need to have a certain another different knowledge set to be a doctor, another different set to be a data analyst. You need to have those things right, but don't obsess about those skills. More and more, you'll have a focus on softer skills, because the technical skills, you need to constantly fresh them up anyways. But so the mindset, the soft skills, they're much harder. So for soft skills, we'd always point to stuff like be adaptable for change, be ready to solve problems in a proactive way. Communication is absolutely crucial, and be proactive. You will be part of a workforce that spends more time than previous cohorts at home working by yourself. That means managing your own calendar is an absolute make it or break it career skill. Do that. Focus on these kind of skills. Always double down on human-centric skills. Figure out what can a human do better than a machine, and these skills, they are better. So this is stuff like creativity, empathy, critical thinking, clear communication, proactive communication with other people. That stuff is important. It's much harder to automate. So stick with it. Of course, really obsess about the idea of lifelong learning. Make sure that you do upskill. You don't need to do this with big fat degrees. I'm increasingly becoming opposed to the big degrees. Do a bachelor if you want, but don't add on the masters and PhD just yet. Yeah? I'd rather take in the additional knowledge in little blocks throughout your career. That'll probably serve you better, minimize the debt that you hold. That should be wonderful. And always, of course, think about, how can I combine two fields of knowledge? How can I bring my medical background into the tech field? How can I bring my tech background into the health field or into the data field? Whatever it is, if you combine those two things, you tend to have a leg up on the competition already.
I think that's a great point. I'd not thought about the importance of calendar management, because more of us are going to be working from home. It doesn't matter whether you're working from home or working elsewhere too, but be present where you are and manage your time efficiently. Finally, Simon, I know you well as an optimist. So if we were to embrace this reality of multiple career shifts, what's the upsides for Australia? Are we going to end up with more adaptable, resilient and happy workforce?
I think we should. I think ultimately changing jobs more often is a sign for people being able to reinvent themselves, to get a bit of a new start happening. Quite often when people, and you would have met many of your friends throughout the life cycle that were fired, that were made redundant, and then they take on a new career, and they'll say something like, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. I
Yes,
I
yes.
would have not made this career switch by myself, but I was forced. And then it turned out well. So there's a sense of confidence that change needn't be a bad thing, that it can be a very optimistic and positive development. Yeah. And I would go as far as saying, if I'm looking at the young workers, the teens, the early 20s of today, these are the people that were really shaped by the pandemic. They lived through the pandemic in their formative years, teenage years, early 20s.
Yes.
And that prepared them for change. This is a bunch of people that do not expect the world to run smoothly for a prolonged period of time. they are, you might call them cynical or something in the makeup, but they'll go, change happens and we are ready for it. And I think that makes them strong, that makes them resilient. I think that is very, very positive. So they will be much more confident in navigating change than older people. And of course, the older you get, the more reluctant to change you tend to become on average. And so that's good. And I do truly believe that a diverse career portfolio, whatever you want to call it, is a positive thing, that people don't look down upon this. Sometimes you go, oh, what does my LinkedIn career profile say? Is it a clear, smooth transition? I think fewer bosses will really obsess about this. It's okay to zigzag through your career. I think that's really yesterday's news, that people think you must have this clear plan, that you knew exactly where to go from age 16 and then you work your way up rigidly. I think that's not a thing anymore. And that should give us a
Having
product.
said that, it was the old-fashioned way of thinking, wasn't it?
It was a clearly structured hierarchical society. It was a hierarchical workforce. And this is when he said you work your way up to the CEO job from the mailroom.
Interesting. Well, that was fascinating conversation. I think a bit of a wake-up call for some of our viewers and listeners. So I believe the message is that occupational change isn't going to be the exception anymore like it was in my day. It's now the rule, so we must prepare for it. And if we do, we'll be better off. So, Simon, thanks for sharing your insights. And to our viewers and listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode, again, please make sure you subscribe or follow, depending upon which app you're listening to. Just click that. So once a week, you get the Demographics Decoded podcast wherever you're listening to this. And do us a favor, please share it with a friend or colleague. You're going to help us grow our audience and pass the message on to more people. But I hope you're also going to help your friend who's going to hear something that they may be fearing at the moment, and we'll give them some comfort as well, that change is something they need to plan for. Look forward to catching up with you next week, Simon.
Fantastic.